Welcome back to the channel, dear listeners. Tonight, we delve into the mysterious and chilling story titled, My Mother Left Me Alone in the Woods, and a Stranger's Shocking Revelation Changed Everything. Gather close and listen well, for this story will take you on a journey filled with suspense, unexpected twists, and a revelation that will leave you speechless. So, without further ado, let us begin. Time in the village seemed to freeze on the day when people first learned about the existence of wonders like television, gas stoves, and computers. Electricity was only introduced to the village in the late 1960s, and within 20 years, it disappeared again. Betsy was born on the very day when the last light bulb in Cranston's house went out, on May 13th, 1989. Those who have grown accustomed to luxuries like artificial light were a bit upset. They even intended to reach out to the city authorities, located 80 kilometers away from the settlement, after the spring thaw. But by the time the impassable roads dried up, they had adapted to the new circumstances and directed their righteous anger towards more practical matters, their gardens, hunting, and the care of their livestock, without which survival was impossible. There was a single generator owned by Brian, a former local law enforcement officer who is now retired and enjoyed tinkering with various machines. It would run for a couple of hours in the evening starting from the end of September until New Year's. Typically, by the 3rd of January, the fuel ran out and the entire village plunged into darkness until June. Armed with kerosene lamps and candles, people would gather at Cranston's in the evenings. They sang sad songs, reminisced about the past, and dreamed of the future. Years passed by. Some of the youth managed to occasionally escape this oppressive reality, but more often than not, when they went to the city to find work, they disappeared without a trace. Their wives, who sometimes had managed to have children, were left to wonder about the reasons for such a turn of events. Whether their husbands had abandoned them or something tragic and irreversible had befallen them was anyone's guess. In the country at that time, the 90s were gaining momentum and nobody cared about anyone else. The last combined from the small collective farm had been dismantled and sold for pots. The remnants of last year's cabbage rotted at the vegetable depot, located in the church that had been destroyed back in the 1930s. The library and school had closed down. The former village doctor, also the midwife, saw patients at his home with all his remaining strength, prescribing meaningless prescriptions that no one within a 40-square-kilometer radius could fulfill. In 1994, some kind of official arrived in the village. Judging by his ambitions and girth, he was quite influential. He gathered everyone who remained in the field near the dump, a total of 34 people, loudly, as if he were surrounded by deaf or mentally challenged individuals. He announced that gas and a road would soon be brought to the village. He wished everyone patience and faith in a prosperous future. Just as swiftly, he disappeared, urging those who had heard him to vote for him when the time came. People scratched their heads, thinking that maybe they would at least renovate the community center so they could set up a polling station there, but by the next day, they had already forgotten about the miraculous appearance of the portly man, and life returned to its previous and hurried course. Betsy's fate was no different from the others. When she turned 2, her enthusiastic father left for the city in search of better opportunities and never returned. She and her mother, Laura, were left alone. At first, Laura sincerely tried to manage the household on her own, but after 3 years, she gave up. Betsy remembered the moment when her mother's life seemed to leave her all at once. She felt it physically, as if an electric shock had passed through her fragile body. Laura's soul flickered for the last time, only to be extinguished forever. To an outsider, it might have seemed that Laura was still living. She walked on 2 legs, kneaded dough with her hands, milked a goat, and collected eggs in the chicken co-op. But all of this happened mechanically, like the flight of a star that continued to shine in the night sky. In reality, she had been dead for a long time. Sometimes, in the midst of preparing dough, she would dip her tanned hands into the flour and suddenly freeze, becoming a lifeless wax figure for a whole minute. Or when leaning over the goat, she would remain in such a posture for a long time, frightening the animal. Half a year later, Laura almost stopped cooking. She stopped planting onions and potatoes. Even the goat once disappeared and never returned, no matter how much her father searched for it. Mom began to seriously indulge in alcohol and underwent a transformation. The mournful melodies of sad songs that used to fill Cranston's house were replaced by drunken shouts. Brian's generator finally gave out, and the former law enforcement officer himself succumbed to a stroke. For quiet months later, so quietly that it was only noticed on the third day, he passed away, heading to a better world. Betsy was saved by her grandmother. If it weren't for her, it's unknown how her life, which had barely begun, would have ended. Betsy always knew of her existence, but had never seen her before. At least, she couldn't recall her face or her presence in the house. She only knew that she existed. Her name was Rose, and she lived alone in a cabin deep in the forest. A few people from the village knew the way to her. Whenever misfortune struck a family, be it human illness, a Poe harvest, or the sudden loss of livestock, they would send a messenger into the woods immediately. Graham Morris was considered a witch by everyone. Her name was whispered in hushed tones. People were very afraid of her, and perhaps even held some resentment because of her dissimilarity to themselves, the impoverished ones trapped in this forest law and powerless to change their fate. But despite the chaotic mix of emotions, they sought healing and relief from her, not from a doctor. They would bring eggs, sugar, salt, a jar of honey, or a package of rare Indian tea. In most cases, Graham Morris helped, using either some healing herbs, incantations, or just advice. But no one rushed to love Graham Morris because, deep down, they thought that things were probably meant to be this way. Only once in the last 15 years did Graham Morris appear in person to take Betsy with her. She came early in the morning, around 4 o'clock. Betsy immediately understood that someone special had come for her that morning. Betsy silently got out of bed, put on a light dress, tied a kerchief around her head, and, without shoes, followed Graham Morris. Betsy's bare child's feet, wind-bitten up to her knees, tingled from the cold dew, but the warm hand tightly holding Betsy's hand warmed her from the inside, like a stove. Betsy knew that her life would change forever from that day on. She knew that no troubles awaited her for many years to come. She was now in safe hands. It was impossible to measure how long they walked. 3 hours, 3 days, 3 centuries. Betsy's heart was bursting, ready to explode from the excess of true life. Unlike the cramped houses left behind in the village, everything here seemed real, emerging from eternity and directed into the deepest corners of the universe. When they finally reached Graham Morris's cabin, Betsy felt as if she had lived a whole lifetime. Yet, during all that time, not a word had been spoken between the two. A vivid memory from that time was a small boy who had somehow ended up in Graham Morris's cabin with some man. Where had they come from? Were they already there when Betsy first entered the house, or did they appear seemingly out of nowhere a little later? Betsy could never understand. The boy was unwell. He lay there all the time, silently looking at the man and then at Graham Morris. The next morning, they left. Before that, the man had a somber conversation with Graham Morris. Betsy couldn't make out a word. Then the man strapped the boy onto his back, as if he were a backpack, and disappeared into the forest. Betsy spent about 5 minutes alone with the boy. He mostly stood out in her memory for how he looked at her during those 5 minutes, with a strange gaze as if he wanted to ask for help but couldn't find the words. Betsy spent 4 years with her grandmother in the cabin before the quiet notes of longing for her mother began to sound insistently and invitingly. Together with her grandmother, they lived in perfect harmony, often understanding each other without words and without the need to express any dissatisfaction with each other. They had developed a special closeness. They roamed the woods together in search of healing herbs. They learned to read together and prepare various concoctions in a copper cauldron, which occasionally drew unfamiliar people from the nearby area to Graham Morris. By the age of 10, Betsy had learned to read reasonably well, could do basic arithmetic, and could draw geometric shapes with chalk on a polished stone. Graham Morris's knowledge ended there. She lamented that she couldn't provide more for her granddaughter since she didn't have centuries to live. Sooner or later, Betsy would be on her own. She would have to find her way in this harsh life. According to rumors that reached Rose, Laura had completely lost her human appearance, and there was no hope for her. Of course, they could have reached out to the city, contacted child welfare services, and placed the girl in an orphanage. But such a thought frightened Rose more than death itself. She had seen and felt how people were becoming increasingly indifferent and cruel to each other, and Betsy's soul was like a fragile crystal sphere. A single careless move could shatter it into pieces that could never be put back together. This girl was special, unlike anyone else, and she wasn't yet capable of dealing with what the world was hurtling toward at full speed. She needed to toughen up, get a kind of vaccination, face something insurmountable for the first time, and against all odds, develop a mechanism for survival and preserving her true purpose. Rose didn't articulate it in these words, but she felt it deeply. So, she directed all her efforts for teaching Betsy the things she knew best: verbs, spells, charms, a deep understanding of nature, and the thoughts of people who were becoming increasingly materialistic and distant from the true meanings Rose associated with selfless service to the forces of nature. Rose considered the souls of brooks, nameless streams that flowed about a kilometer from their cabin, as bright beings. The creatures that guarded the herbs, trees, and the entire root system were also considered bright. Nothing could be taken from nature without their consent and blessing. To Rose's disappointment, Betsy struggled with making healing brews. Incantations also frightened the girl more than they intrigued her with their mysterious rituals. But something entirely different opened up to Betsy. She learned to observe phenomena that Rose had only known in theory. Betsy saw what folklore usually referred to as gnomes, elves, and house spirits. However, she saw them in a different light, with characteristics that defied tradition. She learned to communicate with them consciously, a feat that was truly incredible. Once, when their cat fell seriously ill, to the point where Grandma Rose believed she would die within a day or two, Betsy managed to nurse her back to health by sitting with her for just one night. The touch of her hands worked wonders. A month later, they found a sickly bird in the forest, unable to use its legs. Betsy healed it with a single touch. Grandma Rose sighed in relief, realizing that with this unexpected gift, something she couldn't even dream of, the girl would not be lost. The only thing that worried Rose was that Betsy was growing up as an exceedingly kind child. She treated all people too well, without distinguishing between different degrees of malevolence. Perhaps she could see through to their souls by passing the various layers to which all sorts of impurities clung. Perhaps, but it made her an easy target for anyone, even the smallest demon. Betsy saw goodness even in entities that, according to Rose, should be avoided. The strangest of all the beings visible only to Betsy lived beyond the boundary where the forest ended and the realm of swamps began. Only moose could coexist with these gloomy spirits, devoid of sentiment, and packs of wolves, which occasionally sought temporary refuge there, forming short-lived alliances with the marshes. But even they did not frighten Betsy. She didn't know what cunning was yet. She still had to understand it and come face to face with this primal darkness to gain the experience she so desperately needed. A darkness that was terrifying and capable of swallowing even the purest soul without a second thought. Will this fragile angelic soul endure? Rose thought to herself. Will it not break? Will it not crack? Nursing resentment against God for her gift. And very soon, such a trial became inevitable. Already accustomed to wandering through the paths alone or with her cat, Betsy often ventured into the swamps, skillfully avoiding encounters with predators and wild boars. Rose didn't worry about this. Even the cat could sense a predator from a mile away, as it had survived alone in the wilderness for a month after escaping from Laura's house and accidentally meeting Rose by the river. And then, on a damp, overcast August morning, this pair stumbled upon an unfamiliar man. He was lean and pale, leaning against a tree. As it turned out, he had been severely injured by a moose, motionless, with legs completely paralyzed. The man claimed to have been here for 5 days, surviving on nuts from fallen cones and morning dew dripping from fragrant needles. His name was Aaron. Betsy brought him spring water, secretly took some food from home, and tried to figure out if she could help this man. The task proved to be far from easy. Aaron's spine was severely injured. For a whole week, Betsy worked her little hands tirelessly, dedicating almost all her strength to the stranger. But to her delight, she succeeded. Aaron managed to stand, and within 3 more days, he could move confidently, although the pain still tormented him. Betsy, who had grown thinner and weaker, not telling Grandma Rose about what was happening, intended to complete the treatment. However, on the 11th day, she did not find Aaron in the shelter he had built. He had apparently left without deigning to thank the girl or bid farewell like a human being. This turn of events greatly upset Betsy, and a sense of impending doom began to consume her soul. Rose had been wondering about the transformations her granddaughter was going through and, unable to contain herself any longer, demanded an explanation for the first time in many years. And Betsy herself understood that she would have to reveal everything because the wall of darkness descending upon their destinies was already obscuring the inner horizon of her heart. Even the bright friends who had previously been visible only to her, lively and radiant, suddenly fell silent and hid, frightened by the impending and irreversible changes. Grandma, upon hearing the story of Aaron, grew pale and froze in place, just as Laura had done in those days when life had gradually begun to slip away from her physical shell. Fortunately, this was only a superficial similarity. Grandma remained the same, alive, all understanding, and in control of her destiny. She held her granddaughter tightly, stroked her head, and uttered only one phrase. Sooner or later, this had to happen. You must go through this. There's no other way. What Rose meant by that, Betsy didn't understand at all at the time, but a week later, four enraged men with guns appeared at their doorstep. They accused Rose of helping an escaped prisoner who had ultimately killed an entire family before taking his own life. It turned out that he had escaped from prison with a singular goal: to seek revenge on his former girlfriend, who, in his eyes, had landed him behind bars. During his time in captivity, she had married someone else and had a child. No one survived. The men, showering Rose with curses and inexplicably shooting her innocent cat, left for the village, vowing to return and burn the supposed seed in Eclair, along with its inhabitants, if they hadn't disappeared by then, hoping to erase all memory of them. In Betsy's perception, all of this looked like a nightmarish absurdity. She couldn't even distinguish the faces of these uninvited guests brandishing their guns. She saw only black shadows, swallowing the last rays of light. Then there was a loud shot, like a big fish leaping out of the water, splashing back into the surface. The cat seemed to split in two. One lay on the grass with its side pierced by pellets, gazing naively into the distance, while the other, as white as a cloud, hovered about a meter above the ground, ready to soar into the sky at any moment. Gran Maros appeared before Betsy in the form of a young girl with golden hair, surrounded by swirling blue spirals at breakneck speed. She exuded an irresistible force that could probably flatten these light-devouring shadows and cast them far beyond the forest's borders. But Rose didn't harm the guests. She silently listened to all their threats, gazing sternly to the edge of the clearing, and then transformed back into her usual grandmotherly form, tears streaming down her cheeks for the first time in their entire time together with Betsy. Betsy didn't understand the meaning of the surreal spectacle she had just witnessed. The shadows disappeared, leaving only the wall of darkness frozen on the horizon, enclosing their cottage within a tight ring. Betsy looked at her grandmother one last time, at the bloodied body of the unfortunate cat, and lost all sensation, falling onto the warm ground, covered with the first yellowing leaves. For Betsy, this ordeal marked the first of many that would repeatedly place her on the threshold between life and death. Her rational mind seemed to switch off, consciousness awakening only for seconds and then plunging back into the vague depths of her soul. It couldn't properly correlate the two realities, the inner and the outer. The pale curtain on the small window above her bed shivered with a slight tremor, as if in fast-forward motion. Days turned into nights unnaturally quickly. Grandma's face, bending over Betsy, grew older and older with each new morning. It was as if not days, but entire years were passing by. Then, all at once, the curtain, the sun, in her grandmother's face vanished. Betsy was able to take stock of her surroundings for the first time 2 weeks later. She opened her eyes and couldn't recognize anything. Where was she? What had happened to her? Why wasn't her grandmother nearby? She lay on a bed in an unfamiliar spacious room with huge windows looking out onto an overcast sky. Above the closed door at the opposite end, large round clocks unpleasantly hung, with the yellow second hand jerkily moving across the dial. Faint voices murmured from behind the door. Her ears were ringing. It felt as though someone was pouring water from an endless bottle into an equally endless glass inside her head. After a minute, a man in a white lab coat entered the room. A pen with a pale blue cap stuck out of his breast pocket, and he held a folded sheet of gray paper. The man smiled, approached Betsy, leaned over her, and placed his cold hand on her forehead. In a calm voice, he said, "Good morning, Betsy. How are you feeling today?" "Where am I?" Betsy whispered weakly. "Where's my grandmother?" "Don't worry," the man continued. "You're in the hospital, safe and sound. My name is Dean. I'm a doctor. Do you remember how you got here?" "No." Betsy exhaled. "How long have I been here?" 2 weeks. "Okay, but where's my grandmother?" Betsy pressed, her voice growing more desperate. Dean's right eye twitched. He frowned, turned away, pulled a piece of paper and a pen from his pocket, and pretended to jot something down. "Your grandmother stayed in the village," he finally said after a pause. "She'll come for me, right?" Betsy began to sense that something terrible and irreversible had happened. She couldn't articulate it clearly to herself, but the conviction that she would never see her grandmother again grew with every passing second, filling her heart with icy dread. "Is my grandmother gone?" Betsy tried to ask calmly, fixing the doctor with a mature, serious look. Dean finally looked at her, hesitated, shuddered, and pocketing the meaningless piece of paper, confirmed shortly. "Yes, Betsy spent another week in this hospital. They gave her intravenous drips, conducted endless tests, administered injections, and fed her bitter pills. However, they couldn't diagnose any serious illness. They concluded that the intense stress had simply weakened her body without affecting any vital functions. Thank goodness." Now, Betsy felt different, not the same as she had been just a month ago. As she delved into the depths of her being, she realized that the scope of these depths had multiplied many times over. Initially, she was frightened that she might have lost her previous abilities to see and interact with what was inaccessible to most people, but then she began to fear the opposite. Her gift had become too immense, and the dark, barely discernible boundaries were lost in the thick fog of the unknown. Who had she become? What was she capable of now, and where should she go in this new reality, when there was no grandmother or mother by her side? No one could provide her with the right direction, and no one could support her or explain the rules by which she would now have to live. Betsy decided to let herself be carried away by the current for a while. Let it take her wherever it pleased, and she would simply be a passenger, observing, studying, and trying to understand at which station she could disembark and turn her destiny in the desired direction. Directly from the hospital, they took her even further north to a small town, on the outskirts of which stood the children's orphanage called Clear Creek. The name sounded optimistic, however. The reality turned out to be completely different. The orphanage was an old building made of weathered red bricks, with the left wing housing girls and the right wing housing boys. In the three-story central part, there were classrooms, a medical office with an attached five-bed infirmary, a dining hall that perpetually smelled of fish, and an assembly hall that was mostly off-limits to everyone. Betsy was placed in room number 33, where three other girls lived: Kristen, Emily, and Jessica. Kristen, a plump, tall girl of 12, with a perpetually shiny face covered in pimples, was the unofficial leader in this random group. The classes were not organized by age or academic ability, but followed some entirely incomprehensible criteria. This meant that in one room, the age difference among the residents could be up to 4 years. Kristen and Jessica tried to assert their dominance over Betsy, but as soon as Betsy exceeded their unspoken boundaries, she faced a stern response. Emily was the most withdrawn of them all, always silent and with eyes that seemed ready to burst into tears at any moment. She went unnoticed, but when someone needed to vent their anger on someone, it was invariably her. Emily was 6 months younger than Betsy, so they were drawn together by their relative helplessness. Their friendship was tentative, surface level, and not binding in any way. Betsy noticed that this arrangement didn't sit well with Emily, who, in terms of shyness and reticence, wasn't much different from Betsy. In the first few days, the others observed Betsy, unsure whether to challenge her resilience immediately. However, after half a month, in early October, Betsy began to feel that she had also become a target for both Kristen and Jessica. She did her best to avoid conflicts, but the more she endured, the stronger the girl's desire to punish her for her meekness grew. Such passivity was not welcomed here. No one could blend into this group. Everyone had to bear a label that made it clear who they were and what to expect from them. With only basic reading skills and a limited grasp of elementary mathematics, Betsy was ignorant of history, geography, and could only write in printed letters. Seeing such helplessness, the children laughed at her, considering her mentally challenged, even though they weren't particularly bright themselves. However, by New Year, Betsy managed to catch up on what she had missed, greatly impressing everyone, especially the teachers who had initially dismissed her. She found herself particularly drawn to botany and art classes. Previously, she simply felt a connection to every plant, knew everything about its properties, read its fate, meaning, and purpose. Now, Betsy began to understand the physical structure of plants. All those tendrils, pistils, and stamens fascinated her. The categorization into species, growth zones, and especially the Latin names sounded like music to her. During art lessons, after gaining an understanding of perspective and the golden ratio, she tried to depict what she saw beyond the physical shell. Bob, The teacher of visual arts and music appreciated her fantasies and even took a special interest in some details. He asked many questions and widened his eyes in astonishment at her unexpected answers. He wholeheartedly believed in Betsy's incredible abilities without any doubt, but perhaps, for the sake of further reassurance, he proposed an unusual experiment. Based on the rather vague explanations provided by the girl when she attempted to describe how she could project her consciousness beyond her body and freely traverse her familiar world while communicating with various beings, he concluded that she might be able to read, for example, a note, the content of which she did not know but had in her possession and knew exactly where it was placed. Bob led her to his room on the third floor, allowed her to touch the doorknob, a piece of paper on which he had written two arbitrary words, and wooden tabletop clock under which he had placed this piece of paper. That night, the girl was supposed to mentally, in her astral body, as he put it, enter his room and read those two words. The reason for physically touching the objects was that otherwise, the girl could neither open the door nor lift the clock nor unfold the note. Betsy found this game intriguing. For her, the task was entirely trivial, but it was amusing to witness the astonishment in an adult's eyes yet again. Moreover, Bob told her many interesting stories about Tibetan monks, Indian yogis, a certain Vanga who attracted crowds seeking prophecies, Nostradamus, and much more. These stories reassured Betsy, making her realize that she was not alone in this world. Therefore, if necessary, she had somewhere to go and someone to turn to. The note contained a short phrase, "This is possible." Bob was ecstatic about the successful experiment. Betsy, on the other hand, simply smiled, pleased that she had inspired her art teacher. Girls from neighboring rooms began to visit Betsy frequently, asking her to draw angels, unicorns, or elves in their diaries or letters. Her art lessons paid off, and this newfound skill saved Betsy from further descending into the loser caste. Even Kristen stopped bothering her. Emily, on the other hand, was constantly hovering around her like a moth around a lit lamp. Betsy had the opportunity to explore the orphanage more thoroughly. Previously, she was afraid to venture far beyond the girls' wing. Now, her excursions became more frequent, taking her further away from room number 33. This led her to the boiler room, where she met Uncle Jonathan, the local stoker whom even the 15-year-old teenagers feared. Uncle Jonathan was a tall man, although not proportionally slim. Moreover, he was missing one eye and a terrible scar stretched across his face from the left eyebrow to the right cheek. No one had ever heard him speak, which led everyone to believe he was mute. He never harmed the children, never waved his hands or stomped his feet. Nevertheless, the children tried to stay away from both him and the boiler room. Betsy was not at all frightened by him. She saw more than just those incomprehensible human dimensions, scars, and the one-eyed stern face. She saw a kind, almost childishly naive soul, completely devoid of malice, pride, or anger. This soul was burdened by only one thing, an unbearable pain from a long-standing loss and a certain duty imposed on this man by fate. Betsy found herself in the boiler room for the first time in January. Outside the orphanage, the frost was crackling and deceitful drafts roamed the rooms. As a result, they had to set up 5 additional beds in the medical ward to accommodate all the sick children with fevers and coughs. Classes had to be canceled, and an unofficial quarantine was imposed on the residential area. All 3 of Betsy's roommates ended up in the medical ward, so she felt lonely, wrapped in her blanket. After dinner, she didn't return to her wing but ventured into the basement, where she found the door slightly ajar. There, she discovered the warm boiler room and the fearsome one-eyed uncle, Jonathan. "Hello," Betsy said, suddenly appearing before the giant emerging from the darkness. He startled, scrutinized her attentively, and said nothing, continuing to toss wet coal into the furnace. "Can I sit here for a while?" The girl continued, taking another hesitant step forward. "It's boring and cold in the dorms, and everyone is sick." The man continued to remain silent, as if he had already forgotten about Betsy's presence. "My name is Betsy." She decided to introduce herself. After these words, the man froze, looked at her again, but this time differently, as if trying to recognize someone familiar in her. Then he put down the shovel, went to the far corner of the boiler room, and returned with a chair in his hand. After wiping it with a towel, he placed it against the wall opposite the open furnace and unexpectedly said, "Do you want to wash the fire?" Betsy was surprised. She, like the other children, had thought that Uncle Jonathan was mute, but it turned out he could speak. From his perspective, this seemed to be some kind of special outpouring of trust, the reasons for which were still unclear to the girl. "Yes," Betsy nodded and sat down in the offered chair. "My name is Jonathan." The man spoke again. From that frosty January day, Betsy visited the boiler room almost every evening, less frequently spending time with Bob. With Uncle Jonathan, they drank tea, and sometimes he even cut a narrow strip of cake. The creamy taste of it remained etched in Betsy's memory for life. Although Uncle Jonathan was not particularly talkative, over the course of their 4-month acquaintance, he managed to tell the girl many interesting things about his life, what he wanted most, and what he dreamt of. It turned out that the terrible scar on his face dated back to his time in the Afghan War. Perhaps he would never have shared such detailed stories about those horrifying times with Betsy if it weren't closely tied to another tragic story from his life, concerning his daughter. "Her name was Betsy," he would say, "when I ended up in Afghan captivity, and then we all returned home. They forgot about me. At first, they thought I was missing in action, and a year and a half later, they buried me. They even put a gravestone in the cemetery. I saw it with my own eyes. My wife, God rest her soul, did her best to hold it together. She worked 2 jobs from morning till night, but after a couple of years, she broke down." Betsy was 9 years old then, almost your age, a smart kid, always was. "Tina and I got married early. I was 18, and she was a year younger. I got drafted into the army at 25, but I managed to admire my daughter. By the time she was 4, she had learned to read by herself and would go to the library. Because of the bookshelves, you couldn't see her, and Tina, my wife, started drinking heavily. Well, that's when problems at work started, too. Besides being a bright kid, Betsy was growing up too fast for her own good, and it took a toll on her. The responsibilities of running the household fell heavily on her young shoulders. It consumed all her time and energy, leaving nothing for her studies. When the teachers raised concerns, they brought in child protective services. They didn't waste any time and took Betsy away from Tina, sending her to the orphanage. My wife completely lost herself over this. She hung on for another year, and, well, she's not with us anymore. She rests beside my empty grave now. By the time I managed to escape from captivity, I had been through a lot. The journey from Afghanistan was long and arduous. I tasted a lot of sorrow, saw many things along the way, but I still made it back alive. My home greeted me with a crumbling roof, broken windows, and complete neglect. I learned from the neighbors what had happened in all those years, but they only knew the general outlines of the story. Life was tough for them as well. They had no business with others. I went to various offices, hoping to find a way to locate my daughter. Either they truly knew nothing about her, or they didn't want me to meet her. I spent 6 months going from office to office, but I couldn't get any results. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I resolved to visit and search every children's home and orphanage. I dreamt that I would find my little girl, and we would live happily and prosperously together, heart to heart. I would work hard, educate her, raise her to be a fine young lady, and be proud of her for the rest of my days. So, for 7 years, I roamed and dreamed until I ended up here. And here I stopped, not because I'm tired, but because I realized that Betsy will soon turn 18, and there's no point in my wandering through orphanages anymore. She's already grown up, maybe even got married, received the apartment she's entitled to. What would I achieve by showing up like this? Hello, I'd say, I'm your father. Do you remember me, my daughter? But I just wish I could lay eyes on her, even for a moment. This story deeply moved Betsy. In her eyes, Uncle Jonathan became even more immense, not just in stature, but in spirit too. How much had he endured? Before this, Betsy considered her own destiny challenging, but now she realized that there were people whose trials overshadowed her own. If only she knew how many more tests awaited her in the future. She felt a strong desire to somehow help her new friend. She remembered the art teacher's experiment and thought that perhaps she could do something similar, but this time with a secret phrase, and she needed at least a photograph of Uncle Jonathan's daughter. Do you have a photo of her? Betsy asked. Uncle Jonathan opened an iron cabinet, rummaged through his belongings, and after a minute, handed Betsy a card with a picture of his daughter. She was around 10 years old in the photo, sitting in a chair with an open book in her hands, her lips barely curving into a playful smile as she looked straight into the camera. Betsy concentrated as hard as she could on the image. The girl's image seemed to slowly flow from the paper into her heart. She knew that she could summon it to her mind at any moment. She's beautiful, Betsy said, returning the photo to the man. I found this photo at home, he said quietly. It's the most recent one. This time, Betsy didn't mention her planned experiment. She wasn't entirely confident in its success, so she didn't want to prematurely raise Uncle Jonathan's hopes. Her search for the girl took many nights, wandering through unfamiliar realms. Betsy, resembling a super-sensitive receiver, tried to detect the slightest fluctuations in the ether that might indicate the presence of Uncle Jonathan's daughter. Luck smiled upon her at the end of May. She found the right place, or rather, a rather large area where the girl could be at that moment. She clearly saw a district that resembled a city within a city, filled with young people carrying books. There was a tall, white building similar in structure to their orphanage, with a central high part and 4 columns on the second floor and 2 lower wings extending to the left and right, spacious halls with rows of writing desks closely adjoining each other. Betsy hadn't seen the girl herself yet, but she knew for certain that she was somewhere among these people, also holding a book, alive and well. She wanted to rush and tell Uncle Jonathan about everything right away, but for some reason, she held back, feeling that there was something not quite right about it. It was as if Betsy was building a wall between herself and Uncle Jonathan, not wanting him to discover her secret. So, Betsy decided to wait a little longer and try to understand the reason behind this unsettling feeling. In early April, even before reaching that small town, another guest appeared in the boiler room, a puppy with his hind legs somehow missing. How he managed to crawl to Uncle Jonathan's on his own was a mystery. Someone might have brought the puppy to the boiler room, unwilling to relieve him of his suffering themselves. After all, everyone believed that this giant could snap anyone's neck without blinking an eye. The puppy crawled in, dirty and skinny, with scabs all over his face from various ailments. Uncle Jonathan cleaned him up, treated his wounds, fed him, and settled him among the shelves, placing an old jacket on the floor as a makeshift bed. The puppy turned out to be a lively and affectionate creature. It seemed as if he didn't even notice any imperfections in himself. He had become so adept at moving around using only his front legs that he managed to explore every corner of the spacious boiler room in a single day. This activity resulted in new scratches and calluses on him. Every evening, Uncle Jonathan had to bathe him and treat his wounds. He started crafting a small cart with wheels for the puppy to use for more comfortable mobility. On her part, Betsy went about her usual business, healing him with the touch of her magical hands. She hadn't mentioned her gift to Uncle Jonathan before, but he could see that Betsy touched the ailing puppy with an unusual focus and concentration. After a week, when the puppy started to stand on his hind legs with uncertainty, the man understood it all. However, he didn't question Betsy about her suspicions out loud. If there was a reason she didn't want to talk about it, then so be it. 10 days later, the puppy had completely recovered, and the wheeled cart remained unfinished on the shelves. The puppy could now run outside, joyfully exploring the vast world that had been inaccessible to him for so long. He got to know other people and filled the yard with his cheerful barking. The children welcomed him into their group warmly, and no one harmed him. Soon, rumors began circulating in the orphanage that it was Betsy who had given the hopeless puppy a new lease on life. Knowing that Uncle Jonathan couldn't tell anyone about his suspicions, Betsy realized that someone from the residents of the orphanage had brought the puppy to the boiler room. Stories of the girl's extraordinary abilities have been circulating in the dormitories, but after this incident, they gained momentum and grew like a snowball. Bob, in particular, showed a keen interest in this incident. Taking advantage of Betsy's trust, he managed to extract all the details from her, and as usual, he immediately embarked on experiments in his own style. He would find injured or sick animals in the forest, drag them into his room, invite Betsy, and ask her to work her magic. The girl, consumed by childlike enthusiasm, had no reservations about demonstrating her abilities to Bob. In the past 10 years, nothing interesting had happened at the Clearbrook orphanage. The days passed in a monotonous routine, and the sun rose in the east as always. Occasionally, a giant bus would squeeze through the creaky entrance gates, barely fitting through the narrow arch. The first person to spot it would shout excitedly, "Icarus, Icarus." His cry was echoed by other children, and the entire human beehive came to life with joy. The Icarus, as it was usually called, brought new residents, children, or teachers. After that, they would select a group of the most deserving children and take them to the city for 2 days. There, they would visit museums, old monasteries, the Jew, and even dine at a real restaurant with knives on the right side of the plates. For the chosen children, this was a source of pride for months, while those not honored with this privilege felt envy and disappointment. It should be noted that the financial situation of the orphanage had deteriorated to the point where staff had to be cut. Teachers were now responsible for teaching 3 subjects at once, sometimes unrelated. In addition to his duties as a boiler operator, Uncle Jonathan had to take on the role of a janitor. Cooks were reduced in number, the psychologist was completely gone, and the quality of food deteriorated significantly, shifting towards exclusively vegetarian meals. The Icarus hadn't appeared for a second year, and the children fell more often. Their eyes, which had never witnessed anything more interesting than the plastic skeleton in Bob's office, had completely dimmed. Something like mass psychosis had occurred. Bob, inspired by the magic happening before his eyes, took the lead in this spontaneous movement. He ran through the offices of the deputy director, the nurse, the headmistress, and even the janitor, convincing them of some ideas. He spent hours on the phone, calling journalists from the Capitol and receptionists at research institutes. Children, incapable of deeply empathizing with others' suffering, lined up at Betsy's door, bringing with them some injured animals. In a normal situation, it would have been impossible to find so many disabled animals in the forest, so adults began suspecting that the children were intentionally harming the creatures before bringing them to Betsy for healing. Moreover, Kristen managed to organize a business without Betsy's knowledge. She took some form of payment from those who wanted to witness the miracle sugar, cigarettes, old silver coins that were still found in the mansion's basements. She even once managed to barter for a pair of gold earrings, which, however, turned out to be cheap imitations in the end. After a week of such intense activity, Betsy began to lose touch with reality. She felt her strength waning with each passing day, leaving behind a cold, oppressive emptiness in her soul. She lost weight, her movements became nervous and clumsy, and dark circles formed under her sunken cheeks. Something had to be done to stop all of this. Seeing the girl's silent suffering, Uncle Jonathan was the first to step in. He locked her in the boiler room, dispersed the unruly children, and made the headmistress, Tess, take control of the situation. Unlike the children, the adults, after convening a consultative committee, decided to take a different path. In their minds, they had developed what they considered a grand plan capable of saving the dire situation of the orphanage. Endless calls from Bob bore fruit. Journalists were the first to respond to the events at Clearbrook. More precisely, one of them did, but he was the kind whose shows never left the screens and always topped the ratings. This man had limitless power. In a matter of minutes, he could turn someone into a hero or drag them to the depths of infamy. He could make someone immensely wealthy or strip them of their last possessions. In his phone, he had contacts with influential people. However, none of them, not even Bob, considered the potential consequences for Betsy if she were to become the epicenter of all this madness. They were dead serious about the idea that it was time for the girl to grow up. After all, on May 13th, she had turned 11. It was time to learn to channel her God-given abilities into a useful path for society, while simultaneously plunging into real life and taking everything it had to offer. "We will help you," Tess said confidently, placing her heavy hand on Betsy's shoulder. "There will always be a real psychologist nearby. You'll have a private room, good food, and plenty of time to recover your strength. Don't let us down, Betsy. You're our last hope." Betsy, still recovering from her recent healing sessions, couldn't argue. She didn't know the details of what the director had planned for her or the specifics of her upcoming journey to the capital. However, the word Madrid inspired her. She had only seen the city on television, the Royal Palace, Retiro Park, a beautiful cathedral with colorful domes. From her childhood memories, she could recall fragments of stories about lucky individuals who had earned enormous amounts of money in the capital and returned to the village alive and healthy. In her imagination at the time, Madrid resembled a vast forest where instead of trees, there were stone houses and towers, and money could be gathered like mushrooms. It only required being in the right place at the right time. Betsy believed that she could handle her mission. If she could provide such a service to the orphanage, she would surely earn respect and appreciation. Then, she would be able to set conditions, limit curious onlookers, and select only those truly in need of her abilities. The combination of childlike naivety, a natural belief in understanding from adults, and the budding sense of responsibility made Betsy feel as though success was already in the bag. All that remained was to board the Icarus, spend a week on the road, and return from the capital in a blaze of glory. In her fanciful thoughts, the creaky gate's arch transformed into a triumphal arch and the maroon Icarus into an imperial carriage. On May 24th, the Icarus ceremoniously entered the orphanage grounds, swallowed Betsy and her 5 companions, and, without pausing to catch its breath, disappeared around a bend in the forest road. The next 2 days were filled with new discoveries and impressions for the girl. For the first time in her life, she visited a huge city, complete with an airport, the spacious halls, the glow of advertising and information panels, and the deafening hum of thousands of voices took her breath away and made her head spin. But what impressed her even more was the airplane. She had seen it in pictures or in movies, of course, but the experience of being inside a real airplane was entirely different, and when it took off and the ground rapidly receded below, Betsy thought she might die from the overwhelming mix of delight and anxiety. The headmistress and Bob, sitting in adjacent seats, watched with affection as Betsy experienced all these emotions. However, just an hour into the flight, Betsy began to notice that something very important, something she couldn't live without, was gradually fading from inside her. This feeling was somewhat like thirst at first, and then seemed to duck into the early signs of a mild cold. But the worst part was that she started losing herself, feeling only her empty and powerless shell. The first time she truly felt uneasy was during the landing in Madrid. They were asking her something, inquiring about her well-being, trying to reassure her. Betsy responded completely at random. Her gaze was absent, and she could barely keep track of the simple, instinctual actions like breathing correctly, shifting her legs, and not forgetting to blink. Her body had lost the ability to perform these actions automatically as it had always done before. She was certain that if this continued, she would surely perish, forgetting to take a breath at the right moment or make her heart beat. Upon their arrival in Madrid, a long limousine with tinted windows greeted their entire team. Inside, it was unnaturally quiet, with only soft music that Betsy found pleasant playing simultaneously from all sides. They offered her a drink, and she emptied a small bottle of mineral water in one go. Her consciousness became increasingly muddled. With her last ounce of mental effort, Betsy tried to explain to herself the reason behind what was happening to her body, but logic didn't function in her situation. She could only intuitively sense that she was nobody, an empty shell capable only of drinking, eating, and answering simple questions. The final surge of her premonitions was an absolute certainty that their entire delegation, on which the producers and television executives had placed so much hope, was headed for a grand failure. And that's exactly what happened in the end. Betsy could later recall only fragments of the subsequent events. A young man in glasses, his rubbery smile, and large beads of sweat on his tan forehead. The stern looks and scolding from gray-haired professors, blinding studio spotlights, strange people in the audience who followed the assistant's commands with posters in hand. At the right moment, they were supposed to laugh, grumble disapprovingly, or applaud. On the set, besides Betsy, there were other miracle workers, children just like her. They read minds, guessed geometric shapes, and located missing people on a map. One boy even moved a matchbox with his gaze. Although Betsy had never been to the circus before, everything that happened in the studio seemed most like a circus to her. When it was her turn, and a dying guinea pig was placed on the table in front of her, Betsy could only cry out of pity for the poor creature. She couldn't help it in any way, except perhaps to pray for it and ask the Lord for forgiveness for not living up to his boundless trust this time. The audience laughed, and Betsy felt nauseous. She had completely lost control of herself, and her outburst was shown in close-up on the huge screen, displaying her pale and bewildered face. Back in Clearbrook, the team returned, exhausted by the journey and the shame. Difficult times began in Betsy's life. For about 5 days after returning from Madrid, Betsy felt as though a sinister fog enveloped her. No one except Uncle Jonathan spoke to her, as if waiting for some command from above. Even the clingy Emily tried to keep her distance, fearing that the silent boycott that had spontaneously formed around Betsy would somehow affect her too. No one else asked the girl to relieve their headaches, and no one brought unfortunate animals into room 33. To everyone else, Betsy became a newcomer once again, someone they needed to observe before deciding on their behavior. Even Bob started ignoring his favorite student, taking her failure in the capital as a personal affront. After all, He had initiated this wave and convinced the authorities that Betsy was the only surefire chance to save the orphanage from bankruptcy. Luckily, they didn't demand a refund of the money spent on the move and accommodation. As for the guinea pig, it was eventually found to have recovered, but the show of its healing had not worked out, so no one thanked anyone for such a miracle. Bob considered Betsy's failure a mere whim, her irresponsibility, and a desire to elevate her own worth and importance in the eyes of the trusting adults. Betsy's sudden indifference from the drawing teacher left her completely disheartened, but unlike him, she didn't make any baseless assumptions and simply accepted it as an unpleasant fact. 3 days later, Kristen and Jessica moved out of the room. Emily, for a while, tried to combat her own cowardice, hoping that the atmosphere surrounding Betsy would become less oppressive and bleak. But with no changes in sight, she also packed her belongings and joined the majority. Betsy was left alone. June turned out to be cold and rainy. Black mold stains covered all corners of the room. The air felt damp. Evil, sprouting in the vacant space, was getting closer to Betsy, ready to engulf her completely. The last bright entities, pushed back by the overwhelming darkness, followed the people out of the room. Only what Betsy referred to as silver dust remained under the ceiling. It was something resembling specks of dust dancing in sunlight. They only indicated their presence, possessing no special qualities. Yet, even these she was grateful for. Relative tranquility prevailed only in Uncle Jonathan's boiler room. He understood everything happening around Betsy better than she did. Still, he never engaged in soothing conversations with the girl, nor did he attempt to instill baseless and illusory hopes in her. Their conversations always revolved around some trivialities, meaningless facts of life that both of them clung to in order to escape boundless despair. It wasn't until the end of June that Betsy finally decided to inform the man that the search for his daughter had been successful. This deeply impressed Uncle Jonathan, who wholeheartedly believed Betsy. If anyone, he never doubted her gift. After some relatively understandable explanations about her ability to transcend space and a detailed report on the search, Uncle Jonathan underwent a transformation. He evidently began formulating a plan in his mind. Betsy was afraid he might abandon her now too. One night, he might just take off on a journey to find his Betsy. Especially since, in July, rumors spread throughout Clearbrook that it would be completely disbanded by September. The failure that had occurred in Madrid led to a series of other misfortunes. The orphanage's funding was cut in half. Teachers left one after another in hopes of finding more promising employment. The city could no longer bear the cost of maintaining such a massive building. Debts to utility companies were mounting, and wealthy contenders emerged, ready to buy the former mansion and turn it into their own estate. The moment Betsy had dreaded finally arrived. On the evening of July 16th, Uncle Jonathan told the girl that he was leaving for good in the morning. To search for your daughter, Betsy asked hopelessly. Yes. By autumn, there won't be a single soul left here anyway. They haven't paid us salaries for 2 months. There's no point in waiting any longer. But what about me? Tears welled up in Betsy's eyes on their own. They'll send you away with the other children. They'll take care of you. Who? I'm not wanted here by anyone. Everyone hates me. That will pass for them. And you understand why I ended up here in the first place? My journey is not over. I need to find my daughter. Betsy was losing herself, losing her essence, her purpose, her value, losing everything she had managed to acquire in Clearbrook. She couldn't take it anymore. At just 11 years old, it felt as though she had lived at least 3 separate lives. Why did it have to be this way every time? Why did everything have to disappear again without any reason, without explanations, without clear indications of what would come next? No, there wouldn't be a fourth life, at least not in the foreseeable future that Betsy could fathom. Her heart couldn't bear so much sorrow and pain. She could easily relieve someone else's pain, but she was powerless over her own Betsy. The black mold had already touched her skin, reached her veins with its sharp fibers, and started seeping into her blood. Oh, if only Grand Morrows were here, she would guide her granddaughter in making the right choice. She would even give her own life so that her girl could move forward. But Grandma was gone. Now it was up to Betsy alone to decide and answer to God for her choices. That evening, Betsy couldn't bring herself to say goodbye to Uncle Jonathan. She silently drank tea with him, wiped away her tears, and left, quietly closing the door behind her. She decided to accept everything as it would be in a month and a half. However, that night, amidst the noise of pouring rain drumming against the window and flashes of lightning striping the dark lavender sky, she didn't close her eyes for a second. Her entire being vehemently protested against the impending apathy, refusing to accept the future as others intended it to be. She wouldn't give in so easily. Not this time. At 3:30, Betsy jumped out of bed, got dressed, packed all her meager belongings into her backpack, and headed for the boiler room. By this time, the rain had stopped, the eastern sky cleared, and a pale dawn illuminated the departing steamy landscape, reflecting sparkles in the wet grass and large droplets hanging from pine needles. She found Uncle Jonathan outside. The man, dressed in a thick, long overcoat, was locking the boiler room door. Uncle Jonathan turned around, his eyes rounding in surprise, but a faint smile crossed his stern face after a second. "I was afraid of this," he said when Betsy approached. "This is my decision," the girl nodded, "and don't even try to talk me out of it." "I won't." In his heart, Uncle Jonathan was, of course, relieved to embark on this journey in Betsy's company, firstly, because only she could adjust his search correctly in case circumstances somehow changed, and secondly, he had grown fond of the girl. Over the past year, she had become his closest friend and sole conversational partner. However, Uncle Jonathan understood something else, that he had no right to deprive her of a future. She needed to study, to be fully prepared to step into adulthood in a few years. All these upcoming searches and transitions were taking so much away from Betsy, and the financial aspect of it, even without considering her missing documents, seemed quite challenging. Uncle Jonathan could easily sustain himself on the road. In the past, he had walked 40 to 50 kilometers a day, slept under the open sky in the woods, made do with meager provisions, and effortlessly endured physical discomfort. But Betsy was an entirely different matter in his eyes. She was, in his perception, a delicate flower that had grown against all odds in the most adverse conditions. She needed care, good food, warmth, sunlight, and eventually, she would undergo the unique changes in her body that would need proper attention. That worried him the most. If she were a boy, it would have been much simpler, and he had no right to exploit the girl for his own purposes. She had already given him so much, for which he would be forever grateful. But Uncle Jonathan saw the determination in the girl, and he shared her concerns about the impending changes at the boarding school. Betsy's sudden disappearance from Clearbrook went unnoticed by everyone. Children were being taken away in small groups without any system. An address and transportation would appear, and they would gather 7 or 8 people and send them off, sometimes with Tess and sometimes with Bob. Erased from memory, Betsy lost her uniqueness. She became a shadow, indistinguishable from the others. It was hard to determine with which group and when they had taken her. Perhaps someone might have noticed her absence a bit later, when they were moving the archives during the last walk. But an unforeseen event occurred that day. The truck carrying the documents veered off the wet road into a ditch and overturned, scattering a third of the transported papers across vast fields, and no one bothered to collect them. Betsy's documents were among those papers. That's how she officially vanished from existence, turning into a phantom, a girl whose existence was now known only to Uncle Jonathan. However, the fates of her former neighbors in the girls' dormitory didn't fare any better. In the end, it turned out that Betsy had been luckier than most. But that, of course, depended on how you looked at it. They only reached the town at the end of August. Most of the journey had to be done on foot, with occasional stops at roadside motels or renting rooms in deserted villages. At first, Betsy was very tired of this way of life, but then she got used to it and even began to enjoy it. The light was returning to Betsy. Nature, filled with meaning, infused her with fresh strength, fortified her spirit, and willingly revealed its secrets. Betsy read the world like a book filled with wisdom. She delved into every symbol, compared it with what she had seen before, and the summer hiking trips confirmed her suspicions that moving at unnatural speeds over long distances caused her astral body, as she continued to call her gift-endowed counterpart, to lose its connection with the physical. It would remain detached until it caught up. Traveling by bus or hitchhiking was more tolerable. It would take hours, at most a day, to fully reconnect. In short, for the rest of the summer, Betsy felt truly happy, just like she once did in her grandmother's cottage. Uncle Jonathan eventually managed to locate Betsy. She was attending her second year at the university, majoring in foreign languages, and living on the university campus. However, it might have been better if he hadn't found her at all. The girl had no memory of her father, and his physical appearance when he first appeared before her was incredibly frightening. Having achieved everything on her own, Betsy had become very hardened in her heart. She had structured her life in a way that nothing would interfere with her career and professional growth. She had no friends, no external interests unrelated to her main goal. Betsy had turned into a machine programmed to solve a specific task, incapable of being distracted by anything unrelated to that task. Uncle Jonathan found it hard to believe. He genuinely hoped that this was just a temporary complex acquired as a result of a tough life. He tried to justify himself to his daughter for his long absence in her life, asking for her forgiveness. He pledged not to hinder her plans in any way, but what did he have to apologize for? What was there to justify? He had spent a decade searching for Betsy. He lived with thoughts of her. That was the only thing keeping him from giving up, getting angry at an indifferent world, sinking into despair like her late mother, and losing his humanity. Betsy noticed how, after each meeting with her daughter, Uncle Jonathan changed, growing darker, wrinkling more, withdrawing further into his thoughts, but she couldn't relieve her friend of such pain. It was his personal burden, his private tragedy, something that could only be endured, minute by minute and day by day, ground down, dissolved in time, drained to the last drop, and cast out of memory. Betsy also felt guilty about herself. Why did she even start looking for this Betsy? Why was she so convinced that their reunion would be like a fairy tale with a happy ending? She thought they would live together as one family, and no more hardships would darken the horizons of their intertwined destinies. Despite all her experience and her ability to see things and phenomena deeper than ordinary people, Betsy still remained a child, naive, believing in miracles and the triumph of the good in human beings. Uncle Jonathan, however, managed not to break. He found the strength to carry on, but what it cost him, only he knew. He started working 3 times as much, disappearing from the rented apartment for days. Betsy secretly began to do odd jobs as well. She distributed advertising flyers and newspapers to mailboxes. Sometimes, when a new store opened, she dressed up in funny costumes and lured pedestrians inside. The pay was meager, of course, but it was enough for her bucks, primarily practical guides on Tibetan and occasionally classical medicine. Betsy wanted to understand how the human body worked and how it related to what she saw and felt. She learned that the glow around the physical body was called an aura, and it had various shades that could be used to diagnose specific illnesses and even emotional states. The astral body did indeed exist and was somehow connected to the physical, like a loosely tied cord when temporarily separated. Betsy learned about chakras, the connection between organs, and the positions of planets in the sky, the phases of the moon affecting the entire plant kingdom. Some of this she had understood before on an intuitive